about this over the next several months, and I encourage you to stay engaged. I appreciate your attention to this. I know there's a lot of details. Be happy to answer any of your questions during the Q&A. Thanks.
Progress, that's the need. Reading assessment framework for 2009. And I have noted here that while serving in the Massachusetts Department of Education, she directed complete revisions of the state's pre-K through 12 standards for every major subject that have been considered amongst the best in the country, as Jamie described a few minutes ago. She was appointed by Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings to serve on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel in 2006, and I'm telling you that I'm short shrifting her on her accomplishments in the world of education, but I'll just turn it over to Sandra Stotsky right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just get a few papers down here. First of all, let me find out a little bit about you, the audience. How many of you have children in the schools, whether it's Carver, the neighborhood, most of you? How many of you are elected or appointed officials? I know we met some of you, all sitting here in the front row. Very good. Some more back here, too. I don't think we were introduced. Are you from Carver or a neighboring community? Neighboring, okay, that's fine. And how many of you, and this is where I would like to begin my talk about this part of it, how many of you had children before 2011 in the public schools? Oh, that's very good, because then you would be familiar with the standards that I actually worked on and helped to develop when I was in the Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. After 2011, we had more and more Common Core standards introduced, so you would have noted changes, or you would be at least able to notice changes in what your children or grandchildren went through in the schools. What I'm going to do first, and this is how I will outline my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the philosophy that I used as I was developing the standards that your children were taught by until about 2011. The board adopted Common Core standards in the middle of 2010, and so Common Core began to be gradually introduced the following year. Then I'm going to give you a few facts about Common Core and the validation committee on which I served, what its purpose was. I will then talk a little bit about the flaws or deficiencies in both the ELA and math standards. You've heard a little bit about that. You'll also hear more from me. And then I'm going to suggest what I think might be some avenues for people to proceed who have concerns about what is happening in the school curriculum and in the standards and testing areas in your public schools and in any of the other schools that are not public that are also using Common Core by choice. And there is an unfortunate issue there because many of them are doing this for reasons that don't quite make sense because they think their children are going to go back to the public schools at a higher grade, so therefore they're going to use Common Core standards in earlier grades even though they're not under the purview of the State Board of Ed. Let me begin a little bit with my own philosophy. When I approached the development of the standards that I was told to revise or develop in 1999 when I was hired by the department, and I was hired by Commissioner David Driscoll at the time. Some of you may remember him or know who he was. I was bringing a philosophy that came from my own traditional background in Bridgewater, which is where I grew up. I went to Bridgewater High School. I lived in the town of Bridgewater. That's why I know this whole area pretty well. I was trying to develop standards that would raise all kids because we have gone through about a 50-year decline in this country since about the 1960s in our public schools. Teachers who've been around that long, or others, would know that what we now do in high school is at a much lower level than what we did 50 years ago in high school. The English curriculum, for example, is very different from the English curriculum that I had when I went to Bridgewater High School. As one example, we had a Shakespeare play every year, 9, 10, 11, 12. I don't know any school today that would give children that amount of literature from that period of time. It was a struggle, but that was what the curriculum was, in addition to a lot of other things that were different. We also, in grade 9 or 10, had the entire book of Euclidean geometry. It was called Euclid's Elements of Geometry. Yes, they actually had Euclid that they were using in Bridgewater. Wasn't the book written 2,000 years ago, but it was a newer version of it, but it was proof-based geometry. The most wonderful experience anyone could have in developing logical thinking. Today, your kids are lucky if they have 2 to 3 weeks of proof-based geometry in grade 10 or 11, whenever it might be offered. In any event, my philosophy was to raise everybody. I wasn't trying to close gaps. That wasn't the goal I was given. We were trying to get everybody up, which is a different direction. I was also interested in making sure that the standards reflected content as much as possible, because that was what everything in research that I knew, and I had done my graduate work in reading research at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but from everything we know, content matters. And so I was trying to make sure that the standards we developed had content as much as possible in them. And third, which was very important and is only now being talked about slightly by the USDE and Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, I was given the opportunity, which I didn't appreciate fully at the time, to revise totally our teacher licensing regulations, administrator regulations, and our licensure tests for teachers. And I finally put it all together for myself, realizing that if you wanted to have better standards for students to learn towards, have teachers teach to them, you needed to have academically stronger teachers. Teachers cannot teach what they do not know themselves. So part of my goal was to make sure that we were training the most academically competent teachers we could do at that time, veteran teachers as well as new teachers coming in. We had control over the criteria for professional development. And the goal was to make sure that we could get all kids making academic gains. Now, as Jamie told you earlier, we actually made unusual strides. And I'm sorry I don't have this available for a overhead screen, but you can get a sense of what was happening. There's a black mark here. This is from an NAEP test. And this side lists all the states in the Union. And this is about where we were in 1992, before the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, grade 8 math. We were about 1/3 of the way down. That's about what that shows you. And then by 2007, which is after all of the standards I had been in charge of revising or developing had taken root and we had had teacher training, by 2007, we are now at the very top by a considerable amount. This is what is at stake right now. This is really, we have maintained being at the top since 2007. This is now 2015. This is what has been remarkable about the gains to many people. But they are only remarkable if you forget that you had to have teachers as well as standards together producing enduring significant gains. And only now are we beginning to see in grade 4, for example, in reading, a slight decline. We're still at the top, but we're not that much at the top. So we're beginning to see some changes taking place. What will happen in the next few years, we don't know. The Common Core-based tests are only being given this year for the first time, and we don't know whether those results are going to be reported or not. So this is still a work in progress, and we can only wait to see what's going to happen if we want to take a chance and wait. So that was what I brought to what we had in the state from 99 to 2003 in our major subject areas and with teacher licensure tests and other policies that affected both teachers and administrators. Let's go to some facts about Common Core now, because I had the, possibly by now, the unenviable experience of being on its validation committee, which was formed in 2009. Now, what is a validation committee? Common Core had three major groups of people. The first group were the standards development work groups in 2009 of spring, and they were to develop what were called college readiness standards. Who was on that committee? This is when I first became concerned. Mainly test developers. One might say, how come? What would you expect to be on a college readiness committee? If you go around, as I used to occasionally, asking ordinary people, who would you expect to be in that committee? You would expect high school math and English teachers. We were developing standards in two subjects, math and English. You would expect high school math and English teachers and college teaching faculty in math and English, because those are the two groups that know, or should know, what high school graduates should know and could know when they went on to college, if that's where they went, or to a career. Well, they were almost nowhere to be seen on those committees. And that was what first puzzled me. The media didn't pick it up, couldn't understand that, even to this day. Why were test development people put on that committee? They were there. Who chose them? We don't know. As Jamie explained, all of this was done by private organizations. I've told reporters for 6 years, try to FOIA or ask questions, but of course you can't FOIA a private organization records. So you can't get any information on why these people were chosen, who chose them, what they were doing there. Then there were the standards writers themselves. And both Professor Milgram, who's the mathematician, and I, who were both on the validation committee, have written a great deal. So I'm not going to go into detail about this. He's written critiques and has posted them on his Stanford University website for 6 years. So you can find all of his critiques, 6 pages long, 13 pages long, in detail. If you understand mathematics, you will enjoy them. If you don't know mathematics, as I don't, and I'm not a mathematician, I can get up to about grade 7 and that's about it, because I cannot tell you anything much about algebra topics or pre-calculus topics. You have to understand a little bit more about high school math and high school science, which piggybacks off math, in order to understand his critique, which is as much about lower grades as it is about higher grades, but it certainly has major problems, the standards at the higher grades. In any event, we were trying to get information and never could get information. Our validation committee was the third committee formed. He was speaking to the standard writers in math, because 2 of them had PhDs in math, and mathematicians do speak to other mathematicians. They won't speak to people with EDDs too well, but they will speak to people with PhDs in math. But I was dealing on ELA with David Coleman, who is now in charge of the college boards and has been in charge of the SATs, which you may be familiar with, as well as AP courses, syllabi, and tests, and with Susan Pimentel and one other person who was associated with one of the testing companies. And I could never get any of them to speak to me privately. I simply wanted to find out why they were doing what they were doing with the English language arts and reading standards. But none of them had majored in English. David and Sue, for sure, had never taught English at any level, either K-12 or post. They had never published anything